And if we look at the breadth of inflammation-related disorders, it's
my
really
goodness.
hard to grasp how big it is.
What a tremendous impact it's making.
And at different life stages, in particular autoimmunity when you're young and so forth, type 2 diabetes when you're older, neurodegenerative diseases, metabolic syndrome.
Cardiovascular disease.
There's almost no end
Absolutely.
to it. So the ability to address those with metabolic needs is not part of the medical curriculum, but here at Nova and our group and our colleagues here, there is a place for that. And there are people who understand that, and their approach to treatment and research incorporates those principles.
Hi, I'm Haylie Pomroy. I am the Assistant Director of the Integrative Medicine Program at the Institute for Neuro-Immune Medicine. I am also your host today on this lovely podcast that we call Hope and Help for Fatigue and Chronic Illness. I'm very excited to introduce all of you to a very special guest we have today. It is Dr. Richard Deth. He is a professor in the Department of Pharmaceutical Sciences at NSU's Barry and Judy Silverman College of Pharmacy. Dr. Deth received his PhD from the University of Miami in 1976 and joined NSU in the fall of 2014. Prior to that, Dr. Deth served as faculty member at Northeastern University in Boston for 38 years. Dr. Deth has been published more than 100 times in research articles, books, chapters, and a monograph. Dr. Deth, thank you so much for coming and spending some time with me here today.
Haylie, it's my true pleasure to be here today. Thanks for inviting me.
Dr. Deth, I wanted to jump in and ask you a ton of questions today, but I want to start with a little bit of your specialty in research around brain and brain inflammation specifically. Mm-hmm. Can you share with us some of the things that are happening over in your department?
My pleasure. I've been a researcher in brain-related things for about 30 years now, almost. Started out with autism as a focus for many years, and that still is a focus. But when I came here to Nova Southeastern and affiliated with the INIM group here, which had a focus in inflammation, I gradually became appreciative of all the disorders that are associated with inflammation, chronic fatigue, Gulf War illness, etc. And so I started to pay more attention to inflammation. And then COVID happened.
Right.
And when COVID struck, if you will, early in 2020, I, like others, said, what can I do? What's the relationship of the things that I know about, where our lab and myself has expertise, and how might they relate to COVID? Well, it wasn't very long before one could appreciate that the cytokine storm that really is associated, of course, with severe COVID and with COVID itself, is really inflammation at work. And then I began to express my own interest, which have to do with the metabolic origin of things, in this case, inflammation, to look to see what controls inflammation and why some people would have COVID in passing.
Right.
Other people would pass from COVID, that they would otherwise have the severe respiratory complications. What was the difference between those severe cases and those not severe cases? And this led us to look into, I say deeply, the molecular mechanisms that control inflammation. And interestingly, that, of course, took us back to autism as well as other brain disorders, because inflammation is also critical for all those across the lifespan.
And I think so many of us learned the terms, cytokine storm, and really correlated inflammation to respiratory issues associated with COVID. Mm-hmm. But I think what's been so remarkable was the neural inflammation, the inflammation that happened within the brain. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that we predicted or expected a lot of what happened, but I think that especially in some of this long-term care that we're now starting to see, there's such a remarkable inflammatory response that hits the brain.
Long COVID, is that what you're referring to
Yes,
here?
yes.
Yeah, certainly long COVID expresses brain symptoms markedly, fatigue and really the malaise, this feeling of being sick and unable to do your normal routine. These are mainly brain-related symptoms. So, it looks like long COVID is really an inability to terminate the inflammation that was acquired through COVID. And some people are less able to terminate their inflammation than others. And this makes them vulnerable to long COVID.
What you just said was fascinating, or something that I maybe just sunk in right now, which is our immune response to infection or environmental toxins or nutrient deficiencies is designed to be there, but then sometimes the body doesn't either regulate properly or turn it off.
Precisely. And even if we look back on COVID, and we can have our own images, but early on it was clear that the elderly were a particularly vulnerable population, and being partly elderly myself, I paid close attention to that. But then as time went on, other vulnerabilities came along, cardiovascular disease, for example, people that had type 2 diabetes were in this vulnerable category, if you will. And a lot of what ties them together is what's called oxidative stress, or too little antioxidant versus the demand for antioxidant. So I appreciated that this was a factor, and that really encouraged me to look more about how oxidative stress fits into inflammation.
Can you? I thank you so much. Can you help? I always say pencils and crayons for me. I always know if I can understand it, then a lot of other people can too. When you talk about oxidative stress, so I'm gonna let me jump backwards here for 2 seconds. When we talk about inflammation, somebody said the other day in one of our clinicals that, why can't we just take an anti-inflammatory or even steroids, right, for an individual that has long COVID? And is it because the brain's affected and a lot of these meds don't cross the blood-brain barrier, or why are we not able to easily reset? Are we starting to see the why in research yet?
Well, it's always best to get at the fundamental cause of something rather than treating it superficially, treating the symptoms. You mentioned things like steroids. Why don't we use steroids? They work, they inhibit inflammation. You feel great for the first 24, 36 hours afterwards. And they do that, of course, importantly, by decreasing the number of white blood cells or immune cells that are floating around and secreting cytokines or inflammatory molecules. And but what caused the cytokines to be formed in the first place is more fundamental. And that's where understanding the mechanisms of inflammation and what is it that causes cytokines to be produced in excess, especially in some people, is really a more fundamental approach. So you can do some short-term things, and they're very important for getting people through crises and things like that. But for the long term, for the chronic illnesses that we mentioned earlier, for example, it's important to be able to address the underlying cause.
Right. And so you mentioned oxidative stress. Can you distill down what that means in the human body?
Great question, of course. And if we only had another hour or two.
And 27 whiteboards. I just dated myself.
But we can start by appreciating that oxidation is where we get our energy from.
Okay.
If we breathe oxygen second to second, and of course, if we stopped breathing oxygen, we'd be dead shortly. But the oxidation process that we use to derive energy from oxidation gives rise to byproducts. It's not 100% efficient. When we take oxygen, we convert it to water in our cells, and we get energy from that. Actually, it's the energy molecule ATP, to be a little more scientific.
So it's like a pathway.
It's every cell in the body, every living cell needs a source of energy to maintain itself
Wonderful.
and carry out its functions. And so that energy in large part comes from the energy molecule known as ATP. And that molecule is maintained by oxygen, by our ability to breathe in fresh oxygen and to convert that oxygen to water. And as that occurs, some of those oxygen molecules, maybe 1 or 2%, end up leaking out of the system.
Okay.
And when they leak out, they form things like peroxide, like hydrogen peroxide that we're all familiar with. And those molecules, those reactive oxygen species, as they're called, they can damage your cells, and you don't want them to accumulate. You need to neutralize them.
And are those? Is that free radicals?
That includes free radicals, and to neutralize them, you need antioxidants, and you need to maintain enough antioxidant to meet your needs.
Can you give me a couple examples of antioxidants?
Well, the ones in the body that are most important are derived from sulfur. And the one that in all cells of the body is quantitatively the most important is the sulfur antioxidant known as glutathione.
Ooh, I love glutathione.
GSH for short. And you have to have enough of that in order to meet your needs. And some people don't.
Can it come from food sources?
Ultimately, it does. Everything does. Everything comes in and has to get across your GI tract, has to be absorbed and so forth, distributed through the body. And that's certainly true. If we look at our diet and we say, where do we get these raw materials from to make that glutathione? It's the sulfur amino acid cysteine. Cysteine is in lots of proteins, and it comes from animal proteins as well as plant proteins. And you need to absorb that cysteine in the GI tract effectively so that it's available for the whole body. And there's certain proteins that help bring it into the body from your GI tract. These are transporter proteins in particular for cysteine, and they need to work efficiently in order to bring in enough cysteine. When they don't work efficiently, one of the first places that shows itself is in the GI tract itself.
Wow.
And so GI inflammation is really an early sign of a problem.
So with proteins, organic, grass-finished proteins, are there certain vegetables, like sometimes I hear things like do a lot of the cruciferous vegetables or sulfur, like garlic or onions?
Garlic is the key.
Garlic,
I happen to enjoy garlic,
Yes.
which also helps me think that I'm doing the right thing.
Interesting. That's fascinating. I love that we bring it into nutrition. You know, we are what we eat.
Correct.
We're all what we absorb, and every single thing we do is nutrient dependent. This is fabulous. So I'm going to just jump into what we see. What is the, I guess, symptom profile? What is the person experiencing that has neuroinflammatory, free radical damage, oxidative stress? What types of symptoms are they feeling? What do they feel like?
You mentioned feeling important, and quite frankly, feeling implies the brain.
Yes.
As opposed to touch, I suppose we can think of that. But the brain uses at least 10 to 15 times as much oxygen as any other tissue in the body. It has a terrifically high consumption of oxygen. It needs that oxygen in order to maintain its level of energy to support the activity, the nerve firing and so forth that really underlies brain activity. So what is going to show itself when there's a problem, the brain will be an early responder, if you will. You could think of it as a canary in the coal mine or something like that. And as far as what specific things are felt brain-wise. It really depends upon the age, because our work with autism, of course, caused us to focus on the very early years of brain development. And brain development does not occur normally in kids with autism. And kids with autism, as well as adults, have about 1/3 less glutathione. That is 1/3 less of their most critical antioxidant than they should. And a decrease of 1/3 is a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot.
You can't miss it.
Is research pointing us into any direction as to why the reduction? Is it they can't manufacture it? Is there been an insult or injury that's caused a deficiency? What is cutting edge research showing us?
Well, ultimately, it's the uptake, and we mentioned this, by the GI tract that becomes important here. That is the source, ultimately. And if your GI tract has inflammation, then in fact its ability to absorb from the diet the cysteine that it needs for its glutathione, that's going to be a major problem. And it's well known, appreciated, that kids with autism have a very common occurrence of GI inflammation, GI problems, and this reflects the fact that even their GI tract is not getting enough antioxidant. And we tumbled into a whole line of very interesting work by when we appreciated that some kids with autism do much better when they go on a gluten-free, casein-free diet. And I was involved with a group of clinicians through what was then called the Defeat Autism Now Network. And as a part of listening to the other researchers, I understood that the casein molecule is metabolized in the GI tract to small peptides that have opioid or morphine-like activity. That's really surprising.
Why we crave cheese?
Surprise!
Is that why we crave cheese?
We can get addicted to those things, as a matter of fact. So we took a line of investigation to try to understand why it was that removal of the casein, particular from the diet, might be helpful, but also the gluten as well. And when we looked at those peptides that are produced from both casein and from gluten, we found that those peptides inhibit the absorption of cysteine from the GI tract.
That's amazing.
In fact, they're gatekeepers, or they limit your uptake. And so if you have only a marginal amount and you really depend upon that absorption, then the foods that give those peptides will be a problem for you, because they'll restrict not only the absorption of the cysteine from milk or from wheat and so forth, but they'll restrict it from the other things that are in that meal or that diet. For example, meat, whatever else, vegetables that happen to be there. If they're inhibiting the absorption of cysteine, then in fact you'll be short of that cysteine. And this led us to understand that this transporter, and one in particular, is critical for the whole body's availability of cysteine in the GI tract.
And so, not to distill it down, but when we hear so much right now about the gut-brain axis or the connection with it, is and the gut microbiome, is it just absorption of nutrients, or are there neurotransmitter receptor sites that are associated with the gut that are also affected?
Certainly there's a gazillion connections
At
here.
least a gazillion.
And really about 60%, 50 to 60% of the metabolites that circulate in the body come from the microbiome itself. That is, the bacteria make interesting molecules, new molecules, and different molecules that end up being absorbed and being depended upon by the rest of the body. And so the the really gut-brain axis or relationship, as well as the gut-body relationship overall, is really broad.
So I have you here, so I'm going to ask you my own personal questions.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that one of the things that we've seen from being pro-inflammatory during this time is a lot of the surfactants, the soaps, the things that are found in, I always tell people, make sure that you're rinsing your glasses really well when you pull them out of the dishwasher. Mm-hmm. There's some connection with food additives and preservatives. The California just passed the Skittles law. They're calling it the Skittles ban with red dyes. Mm-hmm. Do you think that some of what's happening in the body and is because of us consuming things that are detrimental, mm-hmm. as well as I understand and grasp and appreciate the nutrient deficiency, mm-hmm. but are we also putting things in our bodies that are causing this inflammation, mm-hmm. or a catalyst?
No doubt, because the same antioxidant system that I mentioned here is intimately related to toxic exposures. Matter of fact, what makes a lot of things toxic is the fact that they insult or interfere with your antioxidant system. Heavy metals in particular top that list, things like mercury and lead and arsenic and things like that. They all impair your antioxidant system. But some of the chemicals that you mentioned, all of those, they activate the metabolism processes that generate reactive oxygen species. And if you're low on glutathione, then in fact your ability to detoxify those foreign molecules, and let's face it, all those dyes that you mentioned,
yes.
As well as many other molecules that are either part of our food supply or otherwise get into our GI tract or our bodies, those are all toxic molecules potentially. They have no real role in our normal physiology, and they have to be removed from the body, detoxified. And the less antioxidant you have, the less able you are to get rid of those things. So people that are marginal in their antioxidant status are also going to be more sensitive to these toxic exposures that have become really more and more prominent in our society and our food supply.
That's profound. I think that sometimes we forget about the fact that what we put in, we have to deal with.
Correct.
It doesn't just pass through us, mm-hmm. and it monopolizes critical. And if I just distill it down, the ability to have life, energy, oxygen, mm-hmm. that's monopolized by something that's not serving us in a healthy way, or serving us, period.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And something that's always been on my mind, but also on our whole country's mind, but not really enough, in my opinion, is the increasing incidence of autism.
Yes.
And the fact that it's, as far as I know, still increasing. What is it, 1 in 35 or something like that births will end up with an autism diagnosis. When are we going to pay attention to something as frightening,
profound.
Yes. As that is? And so why is that going up over the last, let's say, 2 or 3 decades or something like that? It's a sign that more and more of the population, the young population here, doesn't have enough antioxidant. And so then you can look at the food supply as well as the quality of the food supply. We can think about glyphosate or Roundup
yes.
that's used, of course, in providing the food by sort of major agricultural interests and so forth. And we can look across the board at pesticides and all sorts of additives and manufactured foods and stuff like that, and say that the quality of the diet is diminishing over time, whereas the toxic content and exposures are increasing.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So what do you say in a situation? So everything that you've said about that is I would say scientifically accepted, right? Mm-hmm. That there are more chemicals than ever, mm-hmm. That our food quality is lower than ever. And we're seeing a variety of expressions, whether it's chronic fatigue, MECSF, Gulf War injury was a 700,000 population in a very controlled period of time where we've been able to research, right? Mm-hmm. The toxic exposure, the
burn pits that, that they were exposed to, for
absolutely.
example.
If I were to wave a magic wand and say, what is the research, what needs to happen in research in order for us to have a profound change in our country? Is there something that's on the precipice? Is there cutting edge research? Is there something that's going to, I get a little cynical. I'm in the nutrition space, right? So I feel like until the dollar's impacted, the soil won't be put back. But in your research, what do you see cutting edge that's coming up?
Well, I think the appreciation that these chronic diseases, which are viewed skeptically in many cases by the medical community, and I could even include autism in that, because it's just regarded as sort of a mystery, and medicine doesn't know what to do with that. But certainly chronic fatigue falls in that category. I think the common underlying factor for these disorders is a lack of appreciation for the role of metabolic influences over inflammation. And this is actually really cutting edge, if I might say that, because we're appreciating at the molecular level how it is that inflammation is controlled. And you have to turn it on when you need it. And we're all happy to have macrophages and other inflammatory cells there to counteract viruses and other insults. But when they're gone, we don't want that inflammation to keep going on. We have to turn it off. And the research that I'm aware of recently, within the last year, for example, has shown that the turning off of inflammation can be a problem for some people. They don't have the right molecules, including some of those sulfur molecules that I referenced earlier, to turn off the inflammasomes, or the structures that actually produce the cytokines that constitute inflammation. So in terms of what's cutting edge is knowing what turns off inflammation, appreciating how we can increase the resources for those materials that turn off and limit inflammation, and how we can, either through the diet or through supplements, we can address the gap for those molecules.
So you brought something interesting into my mind about when we talked about whether it's autism or chronic fatigue syndrome, individuals that are dealing with some aspect of nuanced illness. I think as some of the research has moved into the metabolic stages, as we're looking at what's happening in the cell, we've removed a little bit of the, I want to say, blame game, the emotional piece of, if you would just rest more, have less stress, try harder, change your mindset, that when we're seeing physiologically what's happening in the cell, it's really been validating for a lot of people that have been struggling for a really long time. When we're able to, when research is coming to the forefront and saying, actually, these are white cell, B cells, T cells, these are things that are happening in your body that are not in a healthy homeostasis. It's not just all in your mind. Maybe it's in the brain, but it's not, you're not making this up. And that's one thing about our institute is, first and foremost, when you walk through the door, we believe you. And what's so lovely is, and the synergy with working with you and your department is that research that you're bringing to the forefront is giving us more and more conviction and validation that the patient needs metabolic intervention.
You're exactly right. And in my personal case, the reason I ended up here at Nova Southeastern, I was at FAU. I had an appointment up at their campus in Jupiter here. But I appreciated that faculty here at Nova, including Dr. Klimas and the INM group here, but also in this College of Pharmacy, of which I was previously affiliated, we're looking into the regulation of inflammation and the sulfur glutathione role in autism. We have a large autism program here on campus at Nova. And there are researchers here who are interested in treating and investigating autism. So it's an environment here that is, as far as I'm concerned, cutting edge in terms of appreciating especially the role of metabolic approaches in dealing with inflammatory disorders, and the reason that people experience skepticism about these disorders in the first place from, let's say, standard medical practitioners is because they don't have in their training or their armamentarium, they can't write a prescription, generally speaking, for the nutritional and metabolic agents that are in short supply in the case of inflammation. And if we look at the breadth of inflammation-related disorders, it's really hard to grasp how big it is.
What a tremendous impact it's making.
And at different life stages, in particular autoimmunity when you're young and so forth, type 2 diabetes when you're older, neurodegenerative diseases, metabolic syndrome.
Cardiovascular disease.
There's almost no end to it.
Absolutely.
So the ability to address those with metabolic needs is not part of the medical curriculum, but here at Nova and in our group and our colleagues here, there is a place for that. And there are people who understand that, and their approach to treatment and research incorporates those principles.
And I love that we're coming up with new biomarkers to define, what's happening in the body and in the immune system, and that's so much through the fact that we have research-based clinics, and we do translational research collaboratively with colleges across the university.
That's right. You can't do these things in the dark.
No.
You really have to have the direction that comes from biomarkers, diagnostic assays, and various panels that will say, oh, your problem is XYZ as compared to other possibilities. And so with the understanding and the knowledge of how to approach those metabolic issues, then you can be effective in a way that you can't get from a prescription pad.
Absolutely. And so, Dr. Deth, I want to give our community, I want to ask you, from a lifestyle perspective or consumption perspective, what is 2 things that you would say if you're dealing with chronic diseases, if you have a family or loved one or yourself, any kind of neuroinflammatory things, 2 things not to do that maybe a lot of people do, and then I want to hear 2 things to definitely do.
2 things not to do.
Yes. Don't spray your roses.
Well, you do.
Or even worse, your tomatoes.
Well, you have to be careful of your diet. That's an easy one, and of course, almost too broad. But
I promise I didn't prompt
to.
You.
Well, yeah, we're here because we understand that.
Yes.
But it's extra important because of those raw materials, again, the sulfur amino acids that come from your diet, and you really have to pay attention to that, and you have to avoid the problems of a bad diet and a fad diet, and just find a natural with pure,
real whole foods.
Food ingredients and sourced as best you can from local farms. I live near the agricultural reserve in Palm Beach County, and I'm glad to have access to fresh from the farm produce in that area in particular.
So diet,
diet
is number one, yes.
And your environment, basically being aware of things that might be toxic insults that you might not be aware of in your environment, whether it comes from your air conditioner down here, your air conditioning system. You have to be careful there's no mold floating around in there, and that it's worth the investment to change those filters on your air conditioning system.
And people forget,
home.
And it can make such an impact.
Yeah, so basically just aware of your natural environment, trying to make your natural environment more less toxic at the same time as more supportive in terms of the diet.
And so I always ask, you see all those comments where like trauma nurses will say 2 things I would never do, jump on a trampoline or go bungee jumping. So as an individual that studies inflammation, neuroinflammation, brain inflammation, what are 2 common things that you see people do that you go, oh my goodness, knowing what I know about the brain, about inflammation, about the gut inflammation axis, I would never.
Well, a lot of people don't fully understand the dairy-free diet or even a gluten-free diet, but I'll focus more on the dairy-free diet. That there are an important source of sulfur amino acids is the whey proteins that are in dairy.
So what I'm looking for is gosh, if you're still smoking, quit smoking. Or gosh, if you are getting less than 8 hours of sleep, it's important to sleep. Or staying hydrated. Like just 2 things.
Those, with all due respect, those aren't directly related to inflammation.
Right, I'm making
they're good
them up.
They're good health practices.
So someone.
That's why I'm having difficulty.
Yeah, if you watch somebody and we're all in a room or you're at a party and someone does something and what makes you kind of cringe? I'll tell you what mine is from a food perspective. You know what I mean? You just kind of when I watch people not eat all day long so that they can eat a bunch at a party. I just cringe. Anything that.
Well, you bring up parties. We're talking about things that you might avoid, and alcohol consumption is an interesting one because the very transporter that brings that much needed cysteine into the body in the GI tract and allows cells to take up the cysteine, immune cells included here, as well as brain cells, is very sensitive to alcohol. And we, in fact, showed some of this work ourselves, showed that alcohol inhibits that transporter and the effects that it has are very potent. So even a couple of drinks end up inhibiting the systems that are dependent upon your antioxidant status and so forth.
So
matter of fact, you probably get drunk
easier
because they're inhibiting your antioxidant status, and your brain is feeling the effects of having too little antioxidants.
So because I have a history of TBI, you'll be happy when I tell you I'm a total teetotaler, right? But I will share with you, and it's funny that you said that. I've always wondered since my car accident why, if I do consume alcohol, I'm very little. It's like I had 7 of them. You know what I mean? My body
more
cannot.
sensitive than
definitely
you
more
think
sensitive.
the average person might be, so forth. Yeah.
I appreciate that because I don't think we get that recommendation a lot.
There's a particular transporter for the aficionados here. EAAT3 is its abbreviation here. That transporter in the GI tract, in the later part of the small intestine, down there, the distal ileum, as it's known, is where a lot of cysteine absorption has to normally take place. That's also where folic acid, and vitamin B12 are absorbed in that same area there. So if that area is not absorbing the cysteine normally, let's say because of those opioid peptides that I referenced earlier,
in gluten
then
or
inflammation
casein
in that area in particular will rob the body of the antioxidant molecule cysteine, as well as the B12 and folate that's needed for proper methylation and other important biochemical activities. And I might add also that inflammation in that area of the intestine has been linked to autism.
Absolutely.
Controversially, I suppose, but nonetheless has been reported frequently. And so we can appreciate how inflammation involving that and alcohol maybe worsening that might make some people more prone to inflammatory problems.
Well, Dr. Deth, I appreciate this so much. All of us can be cognizant of our alcohol consumption, of our gluten consumption, of our casein consumption. We can all double down in our diet and really also clean up our environment. These are really strategic things that I think come from this massive body of knowledge in your research, and also are integrating together across colleges. So I can't thank you enough. Please promise you'll come back. There was about 8 topics that you barely touched on that I know our community would love to dig deeper with.
Well, that's very nice of you, and I'm sure we'll have some new ideas, some new topics to discuss the next time around.
It sounds wonderful. Thank you so much for being here.
And thank you.